Ladies and gentlemen, fellow students and honourable guests, I would like to invite everyone this evening to the John von Neumann Award ceremony and lecture of Rajk College for Advanced Studies. This is the 26th time we are hosting the John von Neumann Award ceremony and our first time holding it online. It is my pleasure to announce and welcome the recipient of the 2020 award, Professor Mariana Mazzucato from University College London. My name is Valentinyi and I will be your host for this evening. First, I would like to introduce Professor Attila Csikán, founder and president of Rajk College, and Professor Péter Eső, associate professor in economics at Oxford University and alumnus of Rajk. They will be saying a few words about the founding of the Neumann Award.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The Rajk College celebrates its 50th anniversary this year. Pursuing academic excellence, providing appropriate conditions for a high level of professional development has always been in the focus of the self-governing student community. Besides organizing special semester-long courses for themselves, students regularly invited outstanding scholars and professionals to broaden their horizon and deepen their understanding of the cutting edge of social sciences. This aspiration reached a new level when in 1993, Péter Eső, then chairman of the student board, presented his proposal to establish the John von Neumann Award. Let's listen to him, how he remembers.
Thank you, Attila. This was half a life ago for me and a full life ago for many current college members. That's actually pretty amazing. As eager, academically curious young economists, we wanted to honor social scientists who had had a great impact on us. Simply put, the authors whose books we would carry around with the front cover carefully turned outwards for signaling purposes. For my generation, this was Varian, the book, or Tirol, also the book. For a generation before me, it was Kornai's The Economics of Shortage. Plus, we also like to party. We named the lecture after von Neumann to indicate that this was an award for analytical social scientists, not fluffy or politically driven ones. For many of us back then, the biggest hero fitting this description was John Harsanyi, one of the founding fathers of modern game theory. When we found out that Attila knew him in person, as you of course did, we thought we'd invite Harsanyi to be the first recipient. This was in 1993, mind you. This was a year before the Nobel Prize. He accepted and dropped by as part of his post-Nobel European tour. We thought nobody would ever reject this prize after him, then Varian, then Kornai, and indeed it worked out pretty well. Maybe two quick stories, one touching, one funny. As we were driving Harsanyi towards the old building of the college, he said he recognized the neighborhood. Turns out he spent the winter of 1944-45 in the basement of the building complex, which back then belonged to the Jesuits. They were hiding him and a few others from the Nazis. The second story is related to his lecture and the collection of his papers translated to Hungarian. You know, he never really practiced economic theory in Hungarian, having fled the communists in 1953. Before his lecture, he asked us somewhat sheepishly if the Hungarian word for satisfied can indeed be used publicly, as in a constraint is satisfied. He wanted to avoid any impish or mischievous overtones. Well, the Neumann lecture itself certainly avoided mischief so far. I'm glad I was there at the beginning, but certainly a lot more proud that I can be part of this young, forever young community of Hungarian social scientists that kept the tradition going. Congratulations, both to the college, to all past recipients, and this year's awardee. Thank you.
I would now like to call upon Mr. Péter Hobot, the chair of the student board of Rajk College, to deliver his speech about the John von Neumann Award.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, honorable guests, I would like to welcome you all to this rather unconventional award ceremony. In particular, I would like to welcome Professor Mariana Mazzucato, the 26th recipient of the John von Neumann Award of Rajk College. My name is Péter Hobot. I am the chair of the student board. And on behalf of the college, it is my privilege to present to Professor Mariana Mazzucato our community's award, an award we are greatly proud of and an award with which we consider to acknowledge the most inspiring scientific works on the field of social sciences. The John von Neumann Award allows us to honor an outstanding scholar, a scholar whose work has significantly impacted the intellectual life of our student community and guided the thinking of our members towards new areas of research. Since its foundation, Rajk College has strived to set the highest academic standards for its students. This ceremony, year by year, allows us to enhance the way of thinking and mindset of those who represent this ideal. And by us, I mean the whole Hungarian community of economists and those with interest in the field. This award represents the values we all share: academic excellence, formative work, and inspirational ideas. We cherish academic professionalism, knowing that we students must work hard to master it. However, what distinguishes the John von Neumann Award from other recognitions is that the recipient is chosen through a refined democratic process, and it is solely given by students. Each year, our awardees are elected by over 90 students after an intense debate at our college assembly. This year, we give the 26th John von Neumann Award to an outstanding scholar. The award has so far been given to János Harsányi, Hal Varian, János Kornai, Jean Tirole, Oliver Williamson, Avinash Dixit, Jon Elster, Maurice Obsfeld, Gary Becker, Glenn Lurie, Matthew Rabin, Daron Asamoglu, Kevin Murphy, Philip Aguillon, Tim Besley, Joshua Engrist, Olivier Blanchard, Esther Duflo, Emmanuel Sayez, Matthew O. Jackson, Elvin E. Roth, Richard Thaler, Danny Roderick, Susan Etty, and in 2013, an honorary award was given to Kenneth Arrow. You may also recognize 8 of the awardees as also having received the Nobel Prize in Economics. The list of awardees speaks for itself. Our community believes in rigorous science, accompanied by creative thinking and colorful ideas. With these thoughts today, we present this year's John von Neumann Award to Professor Mariana Mazzucato, whose thoughts and work have intensively inspired our community. And we look forward to hosting the professor in person when the circumstances allow for it.
Thank you. Now please enjoy a short film about current and former members of the college talking about the award.
Attending a Neumann Master course requires thorough preparation. Discussing the work of awardees among college members is already a great learning experience. However, we gain an even deeper understanding when we have the privilege to meet these outstanding scholars in person.
For the 2019 John von Neumann Award, we elected Susan Etty, Economics of Technology professor at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. We chose her because the primary focus of her work is combining classical economics, econometric methods, and machine learning, which reflected a new phase the college was going through at that time in terms of academic interest. We had just started to discover data science for ourselves, and the courses such as programming, machine learning, or text mining started to gain popularity among the members of the college. And the great thing about this process, and also the professor's visit, was that not only people with a quantitative background, but also students of broader social sciences were interested. And to me personally, understanding and excerpting Etty's papers was a very hard but fruitful work. And also getting a sneak peek at life at Stanford was truly fascinating.
During my years at the college, I had the opportunity to meet several of our Neumann awardees, and even organize their stays for some of them. Some were my personal favorite academics or Nobel laureates, others became Nobel laureates since. I imagine aspiring kids meeting sports stars feel the way we did while meeting these stars of our own. You can read papers or books from anyone, yet the top of the academic world never feels nearly as close as during the visits of our awardees. Even with all that information available, these personal discussions and seminars are unique, and they are not just well-being motivating or intellectually amusing. While we prepare for the arrival of our awardee, we dig deep into her works and inevitably end up with some questions not yet answered in any of the articles. Being able to ask them in person is a great privilege, and it's wonderful we can have it without having to study outside of our home country.
Now I invite Mr. Mátyás Tompa, the head of the organizing committee, to introduce Professor Mazzucato's work and explain why the College Assembly decided to grant her the award this year.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mátyás Tompa. On behalf of tonight's event's organizers, I have the honor to introduce to you Professor Mariana Mazzucato and her outstanding work in economics and economic policy. Professor Mazzucato is a professor in the economics of innovation and public value at the University College London, where she is the founding director of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. Her work is centered around the relationship between innovation and the direction of growth, sustainability, and public policy. She is an advisor to various global leaders, and her work impacts policy throughout the world. Through reading and discussing Professor Mazzucato's papers and books, we have deepened our understanding about the different ways we can look at what is valuable and what drives innovation, and how sustainable growth is possible. Her policy papers draw us to reevaluate what we consider to be an effective and useful role of the state. Professor Mazzucato has already received various awards for her groundbreaking work, like the 2018 Leontief Prize and the 2019 All European Academies Madame de Staël Prize. We believe our John von Neumann Award to be a unique one, however, as it is chosen by the members of the college, who are students of various social sciences. We did not only elect Professor Mazzucato for her outstanding academic achievements, but because they captured and influenced the thinking of our members. Her work sparked many discussions and debates before and after our decision, and I believe that we'll do so in the future as well. Members of Rajk College are committed to making our economic system work in a more equitable and sustainable way. We believe that good governance and policy are of utmost importance if we are to achieve these goals. In our current times, it is extremely important for leaders around the world and in Hungary to employ policies that are evidence-based and have these goals in sight. The ideas and research Professor Mazzucato presents are good starting points for figuring out what policies can work successfully for Hungary. Dear Professor Mazzucato, we are honored that you accepted our award and our invitation. We really hope that we will be able to meet you in person in the near future and that you will enjoy your stay with us. Please accept the John von Neumann Award of 2020.
Thank you. I would now like to call upon Professor Mazzucato to deliver her lecture.
Thank you so much to Rajk College for this tremendous honor and for your invitation to share my research this evening. I especially want to thank the organizers of tonight's event, the students, many of which you've just met, and they really made this process not only possible, but incredibly enjoyable. So thank you. And I absolutely cannot wait to join you in Budapest in person as soon as we can. So let me share my screen now. This is the technical bit that can always go wrong. There we go. Great. So again, thank you very much. And what I'd like to do is basically to confront the massive challenges that we have ahead of us and ask, what is it that we need to do to rethink economics, rethink our economy, but especially rethink the governance structures of all the different actors, the collective actors that actually make up our economy. And I frame this in terms of rethinking the state, but it's actually about rethinking capitalism, because the state alone cannot solve any of the problems, whether it's climate change, inequality, or the health pandemic. But it requires a different framing. And so I often say it's about moving away from fixing market failures towards actively co-shaping and co-creating markets. But tonight I've wanted to frame it also in terms of moving away from public goods, because they unfortunately, as great as the word is, been defined in a siloed way as a correction for a problem, towards a real reimagination of public purpose as a common ground for both the private sector, the public sector, and civil society organizations, and underneath that, building public value. And we're really living in an incredible time of change, both tragic change in terms of the pandemic, and climate change, but also real change in terms of how the global community is talking about its goals. First of all, it has goals. It's only since 2015, sometimes we forget, it was that recent ago, that we actually have shared sustainable development goals that have actually come about through lots of negotiation and consultation across the world. Most countries have signed up to them, and there's 17 of them with 169 targets underneath them. All of them incredibly ambitious. You know, how do we get there? How do we achieve these goals? There's also lots of talk around the Green Deal, the green transition. Again, very ambitious, because of course this isn't just about renewable energy. It's about greening our entire economy, production, distribution, consumption. How do we get there? In Europe, where I'm sitting, I'm in the UK, yes, we are still in Europe. In Europe, the recovery package for this very difficult time is for the first time actually conditional, not on austerity, not on cutting deficits, but actually having a strategy, having a plan towards climate mitigation and digitalization, as well as strengthening health systems. So as we speak across Europe this autumn, before Christmas, the different member states actually have to come up with their plans. And only if they do so, the EU Next Gen Recovery Fund will be unleashed. So again, ambition, we need a plan. And if we don't have the plan, there will be no recovery. And of course, there's this word, this sentence, which has become used everywhere about building back better. So all these words, all these concepts, all these incredible achievements, because the SDGs are an achievement of even having come up with 17 shared goals, need, however, an investment strategy. They need a governance strategy. They need a plan. And what I want to argue is that so much of how we've actually framed the policymaking process and the question, what is the state for, has been too narrow to really actually confront those challenges. And again, if we don't really understand what the state's for, it's going to be extremely hard to build public-private partnerships, as well as third sector partnerships that help us actually solve some of the biggest problems of our time, strengthening health systems, achieving a green transition of our entire economies, and of course, achieving those ambitious goals. So we need to actually change our language, and I'll come back to that later. But for now, the headline here is we don't level the playing field to achieve those ambitious goals. We need to tilt it. But again, how? And this is really where I want to begin the focus, which is we need to, first of all, admit something that both Karl Polanyi and John Maynard Keynes talked about a lot, which is markets are actually outcomes. They're outcomes of how we govern the different actors in the economy. In other words, how we govern public institutions, what's driving them, what is their remit, what are they there for? How we govern private institutions, are they maximizing shareholder value? Is there something else, stakeholder value? Other organizations like trade unions have been incredibly important over the history of capitalism. We wouldn't have weekends or 8-hour workdays, but also and especially how these different organizations in the public, private, and third sector space interact, how they relate one to another. And only by beginning with an understanding of markets and the economy itself as an outcome of these governance and relationships between the different organizations that are governed in different ways, can we even begin to confront those very ambitious challenges. And, Karl Polanyi, who's one of my favorite economic historians, was very clear. The free market itself, the so-called free market, actually came about with massive intervention of policymaking. There's no such thing, in fact, of the free market as we usually mean that word, because it was never free. It came about through active governance. Administrators, he says, had to constantly be on the watch to ensure the free working of the system. And Adam Smith, by the way, who we all know is often associated with that concept, the free market, actually didn't mean free from the state. What he really meant was free from rent seeking, free from value extraction. Anyway, so part of this exercise is redefining the basic terms. It's not only not the market versus the state, but the market itself has to be re-understood as an outcome of how business and the public sector interact. And Keynes, of course, has been, incredibly important in the history of economic thinking in terms of thinking of what the state should be doing. But I fear that he's been quite misunderstood, as at best talking about counter-cyclical investments, the state investing when the private sector is not investing enough, when consumers are not consuming enough. So that need for the counter-cyclical role of government spending that has been understood. What hasn't been understood is this quote here that you can read that he said in the end of Laissez-faire in 1926. He says, the important thing for government is not to do those things which individuals are doing already and to do them a little bit better, a little bit worse, but to really be doing those things which at present are not being done at all. And reimagining what can be done, what we are actually striving for, which, again, an example of that would be coming up with these sustainable development goals, is one of its key roles, actually thinking about the purpose of the system, directing the system to actually be achieving big challenges like inclusive growth, sustainable growth, and actually formulating a green transition. That is what government is for. Not tinkering on the sides and accepting markets as given and simply then fixing different gaps that might arise. So what's also interesting is that in recent years, the business community itself has really been calling for a rethink of what corporate governance should be for. Already, Larry Fink had written a letter back in 2018 to 500 investors saying, we've lost our way. We cannot just keep being so short-termist and just thinking about maximizing our profits. That doesn't help the communities, the workers, and the planet. But the Business Roundtable, this association of 180 CEOs, wrote a letter more than a year ago in the New York Times saying basically the same thing, saying we need to rethink what corporate governance is for, because currently the problems that we're facing, climate, also populism, inequality, rising inequality, they're not going to be solved through short-termist, pure focus on shareholder return. The problem is that unless this approach is actually nested within a rethink of how both public and private are governed and relate one to another, I don't think there will be much change. In fact, there hasn't been that much change. We've been talking actually about stakeholder value for quite some time, and we're not necessarily getting there. So what I want to argue in this lecture is that we will only achieve a better economy. We will only be able to build back better post this current tragedy we're living through, but also all the different problems that were galvanizing a global debate. For example, just in January and February before COVID hit, we were not clapping healthcare workers, but the climate fighters, the flood workers in Venice, the firefighters in Australia and California. We will not be able to solve those problems unless we put this very important concept of purpose and stakeholder value at the center of how we even understand value creation itself and the governance of the economy. In other words, it's not just a corporate governance problem. And also, always remembering that the market itself is an outcome. We must repeat that when we hear the excuses of some in the business community that the reason they have to be focused on the short term is due to market pressures. If markets are outcomes, then there's no such thing as external deterministic market pressures. We create those pressures themselves. So what I'm going to do in the remaining time, and I've been given an obscene amount of time, so I will try to cut it a bit shorter than what I've been given, but according to my stopwatch here, I've got another 50 minutes to go. So I want to go through some of the ways that I've been thinking about these issues of reorienting the economy, but especially reorienting the state, rethinking what the state is for, and how to redesign public policy to be much more ambitious and purpose-driven, but also within that to rethink the role of the state as an investor, as a risk taker, as a value co-creator alongside business. And to do so, I'm going to go pretty quickly through some of the key ideas in my book, The Entrepreneurial State. I will also be looking at some practical consequences from that in some work I've been doing globally, especially, but not only with the European Commission, on bringing forth a new kind of legal instrument called missions a new way to design innovation policy, but also industrial strategy towards problems as opposed to a list of sectors or technologies. Then I will talk about how this actually requires something that's much more difficult than just redesigning policy, but really rethinking the value assumptions that underlie both economic theory and our current state of policymaking. And then I want to talk about why this has actually led me to set up a whole department in London, in University College London, which is focused on these governance issues that I was stressing about before. If it's not leveling the playing field and it's tilting, if it's not fixing markets, but co-creating and co-shaping them, what does it actually mean for how we redesign our bureaucracies and the tools that we have at our disposal, whether it's grants, loans, procurement, prize schemes, to actually get the job done of taking these big challenges that we have seriously. So let me begin with some of the key concepts in the entrepreneurial state, which was a book I wrote back in 2013, focused on the need to really debunk some of this ideological notions of, the state versus the private sector, which also often leads to dichotomous policies that don't serve, ironically, neither the state nor the private sector. So how do we actually get our hands much more dirty with the interesting issues? What kind of state? What kind of private sector? What kind of relationships? But especially within the state, what kind of investments? What do we understand from history that has actually galvanized, catalyzed, nurtured innovation across society, including in the business community? What did the state have to do that? And by the way, let me just say now, because I'm sometimes misunderstood, this is not about the state being great, the state being more important than the private sector. This is about recognizing what was required in history when the state was able, through its multiple and different types of decentralized institutions, to actually create that kind of additionality in the economy, making investments happen that would not have happened anyway. And what also made it a good partner for business, but also what was required in the business community to be a good partner for the state in achieving some big goals. Okay, so let me just repeat a bit of what I said before, which is, this whole notion of leveling the playing field. It's a very boring word if you think about it, right? You're just leveling something and then hoping for the best, that the players are going to do great things. But so much of the terminology, the language, the discourse, the narrative of what policy is for, remains within that, I would say, lame, boring language, which you kind of wonder who would want to work in the state if this was the job description. If the job description was, come and de-risk Elon Musk, or do you prefer to go take risks with Elon Musk and Tesla, which job is going to seem more appealing, right? So setting the rules of the game and getting out of the way, de-risking the private sector, enabling, incentivizing, facilitating, in other words, making it easier for the private sector to do its thing, the players. Even central banks that saved the capitalist system after the financial crisis are described as lenders of last resort. Again, kind of boring, backseat player. And overall, the framing, the actual theory, the equations, the maths, but really the economic theory behind all this is one that is about fixing market failures. So I want to just pause a bit on this, because this is where I often focus on, where the problems are. It's not that these market failures don't exist. It's the conception that change can only occur by first waiting for the market to fail. So if you do that, by definition, you'll always be too little, too late. So all the different market failures, we all know what they are, at least those in the audience who've studied economics, but just some basics here. So the notion is that, markets work, but sometimes they fail due to different types of problems, like positive externalities, negative externalities, information asymmetries, imperfect competition, and coordination failures. All these different types of failures do exist, but are they failures, or is it our theory of the market that has failed? If almost to describe anything that's reality, we have to talk about the failure of the system. So really, if you just think, for example, of the positive externalities and the public goods that come about due to them. So think of basic research, right? Basic research is a public good. There's not enough of it because it's hard to appropriate the profits that emerge from that. So there's too little investment by the private sector in basic research. So the state has to come in and fund that. That's, by the way, why I speak with an American accent. My father and myself and my brothers and sisters, we all moved to the US when I was 5 because his work in nuclear fusion was funded by the US government in the Department of Energy. That's not controversial. We all know the state tends to fund basic research and a lot of it. Negative externalities, if you have pollution, the state comes in, bandages it up with carbon tax. Again, very important. We don't have enough basic research and we don't have enough carbon taxes. So the problem is not to say that these failures don't exist. The problem is that these problems are actually quite large, and the history of governments investing in all these different areas, whether it's helping small companies get the kind of finance they can't get because of information failures, whether it's due to the counter-cyclical investments that come about from coordination failures, whether it's the funding of R&D that come about because of these positive externalities, describing them as bandaging up a market that is failing is what I believe the problem is. And having a bandaging up lens will not get us those really ambitious goals that we were looking at in the beginning, the SDGs, a green transition, or even a climate and digitalization strategy, again, what the EU recovery scheme is asking. What we actually require is much more than that. And in fact, if we look historically at what actually got us some of the biggest general purpose technologies, what economists call those technological changes that are quite radical because they really influence production, distribution, and consumption, it would be almost impossible to describe the evolution of these GPTs, general purpose technologies, just by looking at the state's role as fixing different types of failures. What was, again, required was a much more co-creating and co-shaping of the market itself that allowed these technologies not only to come about, but also to be fully diffused and deployed throughout the entire economy. So in the entrepreneurial state, I had a bit of a theatrical part of the book, which kind of said, well, and if you don't like this, then throw away your iPhone. Not because the state created the iPhone, that would be silly, but because the technology, the radical technology that actually makes our smart products today smart and not stupid, came about through ambitious public investments. These were investments that led to the internet through DARPA, GPS, through the Navy, but also touchscreen display, the Siri voice-activated system. And what's especially interesting is that the organizations that were behind these investments, for example, DARPA, weren't thinking about the technology itself. They were actually focused on big problems that they were trying to solve. So the internet came about trying to get the satellites to communicate. GPS came about from wanting to have precision equipment to know, which was obviously very important during wartime. So these kind of Cold War, mainly Cold War investments, and I'll move from the Cold War in just a minute, came about through public investments that were problem focused, but within particular types of public institutions that explicitly took on risks. They explicitly actually thought about themselves as, being mission oriented, a word that I'll keep coming back to and change a bit what I mean by that word as I move along. Here, I mean it in terms of the organizational structure of the public actor. And this is what I mean by Keynes being misunderstood. Many of these investments, similarly with the investments that we've witnessed more recently around green innovation, they weren't necessarily part of the downside of the business cycle. In fact, they have been uncorrelated with the business cycle. So thinking that the state is simply there to be counter-cyclical, to step in, to prevent a recession, to turn into a depression, as important as that is, that's not enough to get us these big shifts that got us the IT revolution and more recently, what we're going through, hopefully, a green revolution. What was required was, in fact, a reimagination of what was needed, but also this focus on problems. And this does not mean, let me just say it now, that the state, again, invented the iPhone. It means that without those ambitious state investments, the iPhone would be a stupid phone, not a smartphone. So if we can't use the notion of market failures to understand GPTs, we surely can't use them to understand SDGs. This handily rhymes. That's because these problems are actually much more wicked. They're even harder than going to the moon and back again, what drove a lot of technological change in the past, as spillovers. These are all problems that have a political component, a behavioral component, regulatory, and of course, a strong investment in innovation component from both the public and private sectors. But as I was mentioning, what we also need to understand is the question, what kind of also organizations perhaps do we need today to have a very explicit also mission and purpose that's actually driving them to think about these more societal challenges that are not purely technological. The acronyms I have up here are of different public organizations in the United States that have been very important as investors across the whole innovation chain, not just basic research, but also applied research, patient long-term finance downstream. But also if we look at public banks around the world, I have a quote here from the KfW, which is the German public bank. None of these organizations actually describe themselves as being market fixing. And yet we continue to assume that that's the underlying principle. And we don't even have, for example, regression models that have a dummy variable signifying whether a particular public investment occurred in a mission way or in a shovel-ready project way, just kind of funding bricks and mortars. So this is really a call out to recognize that some of the biggest changes of our time, in fact, happened through active investor first resort types of public financing. And it's more needed now than ever around the green economy space, but also in rebuilding our health systems. But we need to go back and understand lots of the organizational question that history actually brings up, that must be highlighted in a similar way that no one would just say private money is needed. We would look at the actual types of private organizations and value creation that we think is required. And I've used this word investor first resort really to counter it to this notion of lender of last resort. As I was saying before, these kind of static versus more dynamic uses of the vocabulary. But also it's very important to remember the word patient, right? The state has often, when it was successful, been an investor first resort, but also patient, providing patient long-term financing, not just short-term speculative financing. And even venture capital, which we know is very important in different sectors. One of the problems with venture capital is, in fact, that it has been exit-driven and wanted to exit in short periods, 5 years, when the Death Valley phase that venture capital is meant to be financing can last 10 to 15 years. But what this quadrant shows you here is if you actually divide up different areas on whether, how much capital intensity they require, the level of risk, and turn this into these 4 quadrants, it's really that upper right-hand quadrant that has often been the place where we have had to rely on the state to invest due to that higher risk, but also that longer time period that's required in areas that have higher capital intensity and higher risk. And yet again, what does this mean in different areas? And how can we make sure that the different types of public and private actors are truly collaborating in those different quadrants rather than having a dichotomous setup where you just literally think the public sector must only be in that upper right-hand quadrant and somehow VC will take care of that bottom right-hand quadrant. The real question is much more granular, looking at the whole innovation chain and really understanding this co-investment, this sharing risk, responsibility of the different actors, but also, as I was mentioning, the imagination of what is this all even for, which I'll get to in just a minute. But before we do that, I keep talking about some of these different types of investments, whether it's DARPA or YASMA, Public Venture Capital Fund in Israel, ARPA-E, which emulated what DARPA did in the Department of Defense, but in the Department of Energy, the National Institutes of Health, or different types of public banks. What's interesting when you look at these different investments worldwide is we can compare what governments do with their funds and also what then increases the levels of deficits and over time the debt, depending on whether they are directly financing something or indirectly through different types of tax incentives. And one of the problems that I've seen, also working with policymakers around the world, is that there's often an over-reliance on tax incentives, which basically stems from the assumption that business already wants to invest, and all we need to do is incentivize it to do so by making it cheaper to invest. So for example, an R&D tax credit would be focused on making it cheaper to actually invest in R&D. The problem with that is that if business doesn't already want to invest, and actually what's required is to increase the perception of the business community of where future opportunities lie, then actually it has historically been more these direct investments when properly structured in the ways that I was mentioning before, to really be catalytical and create additionality, which have galvanized most private sector investment. And so it's not that you don't need tax incentives, which are these light blue lines here, but tax incentives on their own simply increase profits. And it's not the role of government to increase profits, but to increase investment towards big social goals. And so what's also interesting is to see how the higher rates of business investment tend to be also in countries where there has been, in fact, a stronger role of the state in pushing the frontiers of different areas, which then crowd in, this word that economists use, crowd in business investment. And this graph here is really just focused on the investments direct and indirect around what government does to support business research and development. And Keynes once wrote this wonderful letter to Roosevelt where he said, you know, it'd be great if we had all these lions and tigers out there in the business community, but unfortunately, they're not really wolves or tigers, but domesticated animals by nature. And I just think this is an interesting quote because it shouldn't be seen as an insult to the business community, but really what should have then become a challenge, which you know, is why I put that lion on the front cover of the Entrepreneurial State, to policymakers to ask, well, what's going to actually make the wolves and tigers want to roar instead of actually assuming they want to invest. And so that need for these more mission-oriented, long-term, investor of first resort kind of policies in ambitious areas, which lay the groundwork to then crowd in a business investment, is what I think Keynes really was actually talking about beyond just the need for counter-cyclical investment. So having reviewed, and sorry if I took a bit of time on this, these kind of big points that I tried to make in the Entrepreneurial State, really the next question is invest in what? And sorry, I should probably explain this strange figure here before I do that. This figure, this terrible drawing I've made here, is basically saying instead of assuming that the market is fixed and you're just going to patch things up within it, the reimagination of a new type of market and the kind of ambitious investments that are required to get there is key to that crowding in process, key to also increasing the expectations of the business community in a new direction. So fine, but invest in what, right? If you're going to be an investor of first resort and not only a lender of last resort, invest in what? And this is where I want to bring this concept of public purpose, right? So is there a common purpose? This word that increasingly is being used in the business community in rethinking their corporate governance, right? Purpose-oriented businesses, stakeholder value. And I want to argue that this notion of purpose has to come to the center of how we think about policy and public-private partnerships. And so really, here I just want to review briefly some of this work that I did recently with the European Commission in trying to convince them that the Horizon program, which had a section of it which was challenge-oriented around inclusive growth and sustainable growth, actually required a new instrument, an instrument that would allow these challenges that were out there to actually have an investment pathway, and if not, to risk just being after dinner cocktail hour kind of talk. And so the inspiration was really the moon landing, which we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of, last year. That was an incredibly ambitious mission. It was developed by the state, by Kennedy and the gang, but it required so much private sector initiative. There was Honeywell, General Electric, Motorola, and also some medium and some smaller companies that helped NASA solve so many of the different problems that had to be solved along the way, all those different types of homework problems. The sectors that got involved were not just aeronautics, but also nutrition, textiles, materials, electronics. The entire software industry actually arose as a spillover of that ambitious mission. And I've already mentioned, the modern day challenges that we have are not the Cold War challenges, even though I shouldn't speak too soon given what's actually happening right now around the world, but let's avoid that for now. These really are those societal challenges around inequality, around weak health systems, around climate. And there was a wonderful book written by a good friend of mine, Richard Nelson, otherwise known as Dick Nelson, The Moon and the Ghetto, where he really confronted this problem. head on. He said, if we could get to the moon and that really ambitious policymaking that was required to get there, and the private sector activity that was essential, then why can't we solve the problem of the ghetto, which he was using as a microcosm of the bigger problem of inequality, as well as racism. The Black Lives Matter movement, of course, has resurrected the very important of institutionalized and structural racism currently in our economies. And those are much harder, just as important, more important missions to be solving today, but we need to be quite ambitious then, more ambitious than ever, even more than we were in terms of getting to the moon to solve them. And so the idea of the missions concept, which I gladly tell you that actually then became an instrument, it was voted on by both the European Parliament and the Council, was that we began these big social and societal goals. Sorry if we keep hearing my echo, I'm not sure why that is. Which, let's just, for the sake of the matter and for simplicity, but also for concreteness, let's begin with the Sustainable Development Goals that I've already mentioned now over and over again. These are challenges, just like Sputnik and the Cold War was the challenge back 50 years ago. But we would not have gotten to the moon if we just said we have to beat the Russians. It had to turn into a very concrete mission, and a mission that would galvanize as many different sectors as possible. So turning the challenges into missions that really stimulate, catalyze, nurture intersectoral investment and innovation is required today. And beneath that, we need a redesign of the relationships and the instruments that we have. So procurement policy can be redesigned to really catalyze that bottom-up experimentation, but not just to bring in the private sector because we want to commercialize an area, but because we require co-investment in actually achieving a particular problem. So an example would be the climate change, SDG 13. If we just talked about that, nothing would happen. If we make it much more concrete, 100 carbon neutral cities by 2030 across Europe, in reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions on the balance between European cities, 100 European cities by 2030. That's concrete. You can actually say, yes or no, did you get there? Lots of different sectors would need to be involved. And then lots of different projects as different as citizen carbon ID cards, carbon neutral urban food industry, clean urban electric mobility, buildings with carbon absorbing components. This is just an example. But so the idea of missions is to make the challenges much more concrete and really galvanize that intersectoral investment in innovation and bottom-up experimentation to get there, and to be able to actually say, did we achieve it or not? Same one with clean oceans, a plastic-free ocean, reducing 90% of the plastics entering the marine environment, and so on. This requires innovation in many different areas, as different as waste management, AI, artificial intelligence, chemicals, social innovation, and so on, in lots of different projects. What's interesting, I think, with the climate change mission, I'll just pause on this one for a minute. Sorry, the Clean Oceans one and the plastic-free ocean is, I have 4 kids, and they all know about the problems of plastic in the ocean, not because a minister told them that, or a business person, or an academic like myself, but they saw a wonderful film called Blue Planet by David Attenborough. And, that last episode of all those dolphins choking on plastic, how important that was to, again, reimagine what it would be to actually have a flourishing ocean and not one with fish and different animals and mammals choking on plastic. And so really also bringing the full power of the creative sector, the arts, the humanities, to also help us rethink what these missions are is absolutely important, as is bringing citizens to the fore. When I talk about wicked problems and problems that are much harder than going to the moon, these require citizens to gather alongside policymakers and businesses to even define what kind of city do we want to live in. There's no point in calling it a carbon neutral city if then it's a city we're not happy in, that we don't experience the wonderful views of nature, but also experience human interaction in public spaces, which allow us to actually interact and to disagree in a safe space. That requires bringing the creative sector, the poets, the humanities, just as much to the fore as the STEM subjects, the hard sciences. And also, again, citizen organizations more than ever. I think, the Fridays for the Future movement with students led by Greta, but not only, across the world, has woken us up to just how important movements are, social movements. And I already mentioned in the beginning, it was trade unions that got us the weekend and the 8-hour workday. Well, similarly, probably without student movements, we're not going to solve this climate crisis. But, that's been true historically with many big innovations. Charlie Ledbetter has written a paper for my institute that's wonderful called Movements Behind Missions, and talks about the role of the AIDS movement to get us the AIDS drug. It was actually fighting for that actually led to some of the greatest developments. But also birth control wouldn't have happened without the feminist movement. Anyway, so moving on, I've already talked about this real need for the missions design to galvanize as much cross-sectoral, cross-actor investment in innovation. But also these missions have to be concrete. We have to say yes or no, did we achieve it? And to be designed in a way that really galvanize and nurture that bottom-up experimentation. And more recently, we've been working through my institute and colleagues with different levels of government at the city level, sometimes even at the neighborhood level in Camden, here in London, where I'm standing, on how do you implement these missions, but also at the national and international level. And I've already mentioned this really important question of who decides what the mission is. And I do believe that more than ever, also to really make people believe again in policy and politics, we need to rethink how to bring different voices to the table ex ante, not just ex post, and reacting to it. But we also need to think through these really difficult questions of how do you also along the way monitor whether you're doing well or not? How do you actually have a flexible and an adaptable structure? We should remember that DARPA, for example, was not just good at turning the tap on for its investments, but also knowing when to turn it off, knowing how to pivot, how to change, how to really crowd in other types of investments. So this isn't just a state versus a private sector, but really crowding in different types of investments. It's also led us to work closely with different governments to think on the financial side what's required. So, and also, on the industrial strategy. Too many industrial strategies in the past have just been lists of sectors, a list of top sectors that need support. We work closely with Theresa May's government to say, look, it's going to be more dynamic if you think of your key challenges you're trying to address. And they chose clean growth, aging, future mobility, and the data economy. And beneath that, actually formulate really ambitious missions, different missions underneath each one that really set a pathway of investment for public, private, third sector organizations. But that does require redesigning those very policy tools away from just handouts to particular types of sectors or even types of firms like SMEs, and really actually helping those SMEs that are trying and willing to innovate towards achieving key solutions around these challenges. So more of a picking the willing versus picking winners strategy. And this is just an example of one of the missions that we worked on with the UK government around 21st century mobility. And putting the word 100% accessible, healthy and resilient mobility and safe meant that the word accessible would drive through innovations in the disabilities area, very key. But also you can see all those different sectors there that are important, not just transport, in the same way that the moonshot was not just about aeronautics, and all those different projects from 100% accessible public transport, low carbon mobility related energy storage systems, and so on. So this is really an effort to bring a new design of public purpose, focus, outcomes oriented policy to then galvanize public-private partnerships. We also worked very closely with Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister in Scotland, to help set up a bank, a public bank that was not seen as just handing out money, a public bank, subsidies, guarantees, or helping industries that were having problems, but a mission-oriented public bank that would galvanize that would provide long-term patient finance to those organizations interested in working with the government around key challenges like digitalizing the National Health Service. And so, what is then, this is coming to the third area there, what is then the new approach, the new kind of economic thinking that needs to underlie this new thinking about policy as purpose-oriented, public purpose-oriented, missions-based. And I want to focus now on this because I really, truly believe that unless we think about value in a different way, literally rethinking the value narratives, the stories we tell ourselves of who is a value creator, who is a wealth creator, not much will change, but also the underlying economic theory of value. And so this is the objective I set myself in a book that came out in 2018, where I spent lots of pages actually going through how different economists have thought about value. But the first thing to say, just as the kind of the big heading, is that it's going to be impossible to find a common purpose unless we truly believe that value is created collectively as a massive collective endeavor. And it's quite, refreshing to hear people in the business and financial community to be recognizing this. Warren Buffett has famously said, society is responsible for a very significant percentage of what I've earned. He's also one that has been arguing that therefore he and others should be paying a higher tax rate back as opposed to evading in different ways. Bill Gates says success is a product of having been born in this country, a place where education and research are subsidized, where there's an orderly market, where the private sector reaps enormous benefits from public investment. And Obama himself, in that famous speech that then he got attacked for, was trying to say the same thing. He was trying to say, look, yes, business, you're doing great, but you didn't do that alone. So this needs to go beyond that. It's not just about recognizing a lot of social structures around us. It's actually about recognizing that the value itself that we create is an outcome of different types of investments in the public sector, but also workers' efforts, citizen groups that have been also very important for making those communities as thriving as they often are, which again, business benefits from that. But in the very least, as Bill Gates talks about here, public as having been important, not just in terms of fixing markets, as I talked about before, is very ingrained in economic thinking, but actually in having taken those early stage risks and laying the groundwork, which then allowed the business sector even to have an area to invest in. This is very clear in health and energy and ICT. And so what's interesting, though, that this whole idea of, what is value, where does it come from, actually has gone through lots of change in economic thinking. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through this 400-year of history, but just to say what interested me the most in the history was a move from a focus on objective conditions of how farming occurred, agricultural land, in the physiocrats, similarly with the classicals when they were looking at the impact of the Industrial Revolution, and they really believed that labor was the underlying source of value, to what I would call a more subjective, less objective focus of modern day economic thinking. And that basically caused a reverse, away from thinking that you had a theory of value, which then determined a theory of price, to one actually that was basically a theory of price and exchange that turned into a theory of value. So let me just review that really quickly. What was interesting in the physiocrats in the 1700s was they were very interested in how the way that value was produced by the farmers on the ground, where that value actually came from. And they were, of course, living through the agricultural revolution, so it's not surprising they thought it was the farmers who were producing value. But you can see here in this first spreadsheet ever, it looks much more messy in their version, I made it easier for you here, that they were especially concerned with reproduction of the system. If the value that was being created by the farmers somehow got siphoned out too much by either the merchants or the landlords, they thought that they were the sterile class, then the system wouldn't reproduce itself. And so this focus on the division of labor between different actors, but especially the need to make sure the circular flow of value got reinvested back in to make land more productive, because they believed that that was the source of value, was very interesting. And they were especially worried about rent and value extraction. Think of modern day finance. Think of the record level share buybacks, which extract value from the economy. $4 trillion just in the last 10 years used for share buybacks by the big Fortune 500 companies. They would have really worried about that in terms of how it could actually render the system sterile. This word, this very strong word, which is because they were worried about reproduction, reinvestment. And Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Karl Marx, this is Smith here. They all seem to look alike, these guys, all with white hair and wigs. He also, the classical economists were also very interested in value. Where does it come from? But living through the Industrial Revolution, they focused on the industrial worker in the factory. But what was especially interesting, again, was that they looked at all the different actors that were necessary. The division of labor, they believed, or Smith in particular believed was crucial. And in fact, his book, The Wealth of Nations, very much came from his understanding of the need of organizational and technological change that was required to increase productivity, increase growth, and the wealth of nation, and really looking through that division of labor and how it had to be increased. This is just an example of a part of the book where he looks at pin factory. But he also was very worried about value extraction. I already mentioned in the beginning that for Smith, the free market was free from rent. You know, they needed money to be reinvested back in precisely to make the system more innovative, productive, and to grow. And what's interesting is that then when neoclassical, the modern day economic theory came about, it kind of reversed that focus on these social categories of capital, labor, also class struggle, which was very important for the classicals, but also that objective lens on production itself and all the different actors and how they moved about and value, and more worried about individual decision-making in particular areas. So the assumption was that firms and capitalists running the companies would be maximizing their individual profits. Consumers would be maximizing their individual utility. Workers would be maximizing their individual decisions about leisure versus work kind of decisions. And then if you aggregated up those different individual decision making, you would get these famous supply and demand curves, which everyone, even those who haven't studied economics, know that that's what economics is about. So where those curves then meet, form equilibrium prices, which reveal value. Okay, so instead of having a theory of value that determines the theory of price, this is a theory of individual decision making, no longer looking at the whole kind of production floor, who's doing what and why. Individual decision making, which then aggregated up forms equilibrium prices, which then reveals value. And I argue in the book that this makes it much more difficult actually to even look at some old questions of what's productive, what's unproductive, which again was actually a really dynamic question in the classicals and the physiocrats. And it actually really matters because depending on what we actually think drives value will determine some fundamental questions like who earns what and why, what is counted when we formulate GDP. So we know, for example, that in GDP, we only include what has a price. This is why both feminists and environmental economists have been arguing against this narrow measure, because many areas around care are not counted, but also for environmentalists, you know, pointing out that when we pollute, just because you have to pay someone to actually pick up the mess, GDP goes up. It determines how we govern organizations, how we price medicines, how we govern digital platforms, and the role of the state. So apologies, I don't have time to go through all this, but just to say that this matters, how we actually think where value comes from, and then how we restructure our economies to actually be tilted towards creating more value as opposed to extracting it out, has actually been a fundamental pillar in the history of both economic thought and history of policy making itself. But when the distinction of, you know, who's productive, who's not productive, who creates value, what determines value, becomes too individualized and price itself determines how we think about value, you have this, you know, crazy situation where the head of a Goldman Sachs, Lloyd Blankfein, could actually say, after the financial crisis, 1 year after the bank was actually bailed out, $10 billion, that Goldman Sachs people were the most productive in the world. And he didn't actually say this to make people laugh. It wasn't an after dinner talk. He was absolutely serious. And of course, he's right. In the current way that we measure value, you could actually argue that Goldman Sachs, which has some of the highest paid workers, are the most productive in the world. But this is a tautology that comes about when we confuse price with value. But more, you know, specifically and really important nowadays, as we're living through a health pandemic, it means we also, again, don't have that objective look at the production process itself. So if we did, we would recognize that, you know, a huge amount of the drugs that are out there on the market, including the new remdesivir drug for the COVID, which is a COVID therapy being put out by Gilead, was actually invested in with a huge amount of, you know, the entrepreneurial state financing. Gilead is now selling this drug for $3,200 without any reflection of that division of innovative labor that has always been required actually for most big drug innovation. Marcia Angels actually wrote a book called The Truth Behind the Drug Companies, where she showed that something like 75% of new molecular entities with priority rating trace their research back to public funds, which doesn't mean the private sector is not important. Of course it is, but we don't have a pricing system that reflects that collective creation of value. We actually have a value-based pricing model. Those of you who know the health talk will recognize this word, which is basically just that. It basically assumes that we should allow prices to go to what the market can bear, what people are willing to pay. And if it's too high, of course, the state will have to come in and subsidize that. But it often means that you have the taxpayer and citizens paying once, twice, 3 different times, both for the health innovation itself, and then having to either pay for very expensive treatments without reflecting that public contribution, or again, pay through it indirectly through the welfare state. So, actually having that more objective and collective value creation process lens to where value comes from helps to rethink also some of these dysfunctions that we see in particular areas like health. What we've done, sorry, I'm just skipping ahead because I'm looking at my time here. What we've then done in the institute that I'm running is to ask, what does it then mean to, actually rethink these relationships by putting at the center this notion of public purpose, but also value as collectively created and governing the innovation process itself, the production process, the distribution process, in a way that really serves citizens, which doesn't mean that the state governs that whole process, but it does mean that it thinks about very closely about what it means to actually structure public-private partnerships for the common good. And there's no, again, more explicit area right now that we can think of where this is important than health. But of course, it's very important if we're thinking of digital platforms as well, or even our energy system. So, the Institute actually has as its mission to rethink public values, imagined, practiced, and evaluated. And we begin very much with saying you need to rethink the narrative, the storytelling. Plato's wonderful quote that I had up there before, that storytellers rule the world. If we're going to have a different, more purpose-oriented system, and one that admits explicitly that this is about collectively investing and sharing both risks and rewards, we need to start using this new language. Tilting towards a direction does not have to mean that we choose, that we put all our eggs in one basket, but you choose a direction, you choose the Green Deal, you choose the Sustainable Development Goals, and you do everything you can to catalyze as much investment towards that. That was the mission concept. You don't pick winners, you pick the willing. That can restructure even how we think about the way, for example, that small medium enterprises access funding. We have to be extremely wary of the outsourcing problem, where in order even to govern these processes, governments need capacity and capability. And to get rid of this incredibly boring word of de-risking, and admit it, this requires risk-taking, welcoming uncertainty. So trial and error and error and error. But what does that mean to actually learn from those errors? What kind of capabilities do you require, but also how to think of it in terms of a portfolio? No self-respecting venture capitalist would pretend they always win. And it especially means rethinking this cartoon image that we've allowed to be depicted of what the state is for, just passing around the paper, regulating, fixing market failures, and getting at, the top students at any high school or university are not going to want to work for this black and white image of the state. It will always look colorful to go work with the Zuckerbergs. But this is a myth. This is an absolute myth. Zuckerberg himself, if he's honest, like Steve Jobs, would admit that it required lots of creative investment by state institutions to allow his own platform to do what it's doing today, as well, of course, as private initiative. So, and a lot of this actually requires rethinking the curriculum. Literally, the education, how we are educating global bureaucrats, has actually been fed by this notion of public choice theory and new public management, which does not welcome at all an explicit recognition of kind of that risk-taking, thinking out of the box, investing within public institutions precisely in order to do all those things that I just had on the screen there of actually co-creating markets, picking the willing, thinking in a portfolio kind of way, and also, as discussed before with emissions, being flexible, adaptable. Instead, it's focused almost, on the state really does need to know its place, not just fixing market failures, but also to be very worried about all the different types of government failures that might occur along the way. And a lot of the issues actually raised by public choice theory are not necessarily wrong. The problem is that it's a very siloed way to think about the training itself of the civil service. And again, one of the reasons that we thought it was very important to rewrite the curriculum for the MPA around different issues. And again, a lot of text here towards the end of my talk, so I'll be brief, but one of my own ambitions for some time now, back an article I wrote in 2016, was to say we just need different questions. We need different questions and very different types of also then tools and organizational culture in order to ask the big questions within the public sector if we're, again, going to be tackling the goals as ambitious as going to the moon. So instead of asking which market failure needs to be fixed, we really need to be confronting this point of directionality. What kind of markets do we need? How to make them as inclusive and sustainable as possible, but specifically how to use policy to set that direction of change and enable as much bottom-up experimentation. Organizations, how to build explorative public sector organizations that actually learn by doing and welcome the trial and error, how to assess what's actually created outside of static cost-benefit analysis and net present value, and actually be able to really capture all those dynamic spillovers that happen along the way. Again, software actually happened along the way to get to the moon, but that's actually true with many different public investments, including the Concorde plane. It's not flying, but a lot of the investments that went into it actually created investment and innovation across many sectors. And lastly, this point, which I'm going to talk about a bit just before finishing my last 3 minutes, really rethinking also how to make sure that we socialize not only risks, but also rewards. This has been a point that I often find myself concentrating on because it's the least thought about, I think, and really requires a more pre-distribution lens of how to fight inequality. And I already mentioned in some ways what this might look like in terms of, for example, the production investment in the health area. We have not thought enough about the risks and rewards, but the rewards, of course, for public investment in health is at least to make sure that people can afford it, but also to not be abusing the intellectual property rights system along the way. And unfortunately, today we have IPR, intellectual property rights, which are very badly governed. They're not being governed for the common good because they are too wide, used for strategic reasons, too strong, so hard to license, and too upstream. So the tools for research are being privatized. So this is why the World Health Organization, and we wrote a report some years ago making the similar point. Our report was called The People's Prescription. The World Health Organization wrote The People's Vaccine, arguing that we really need to, for example, pool patents in order to, for the vaccine right now in this emergency period, to galvanize as much collective intelligence, a very important word associated with collective value creation, collective intelligence, but also making sure the prices of drugs, again, reflect that public contribution and so on. But also it's very inspiring, I see, to see how cities in many countries are leading the way in rethinking some of this different issues. For example, in Barcelona, the city mayor, Ada Colau, brought in hackers to the city government to find ways for the data that is constantly being created every time we tap on Citymapper to actually help us improve the common good, so transport. And that requires new institutions, organizations, and new types of questions and imagination to do that. But the big point is really that, this is not just about the entrepreneurial state funding stuff. It is, again, about governing to make sure that citizens are benefiting the most, which includes, for example, conditionalities that today are really relevant with COVID-19, but also more generally. So conditionalities that when the state is making those ambitious investments, there be conditions, for example, even just minimum ones, like making sure that profits that come about from that are reinvested back into production, not extracted, making sure that, again, the prices of the drugs that are collectively financed reflect that. In some cases, allowing governments also to retain equity, like in the case where government gave both Tesla and Solyndra same amount of money, but somehow found itself just picking up the bill for the one that went bust, Solyndra. That's a very interesting example I've written about because Obama actually said to Elon Musk that he wanted 3 million shares if the company didn't pay back the loan. Of course, Tesla did pay back the loan, and the price per share went from 9 to 90. Multiply that difference by 3 million, that would have been more than enough to pay back the Solyndra loss in the next round. So, that wouldn't make sense for the upstream R&D investments, but for these downstream investments, which have benefited private companies, thinking through as public venture capitalists, this is important. And I wrote a piece a couple weeks ago in Foreign Affairs about this. But also, the narrative, universal basic income, very important. But thinking of it again through this collective value creation lens, think of it as a citizen's dividend, a citizen's share what they actually created, as opposed to a handout, a check being sent to them in the mail. And so even changing some of the language and the pillars of how we're thinking about some of these new innovations in terms of the welfare state, very important. COVID-19, as I've already mentioned, is the ground for all this. The companies that are receiving huge bailouts, especially in the hospitality industry, in the travel industry, but also for many companies that just, are having huge problems right now. These bailouts can, of course, come with conditions attached, not to penalize them, but to really make sure we're building back better. So in some countries like France, the conditions tied to the bailouts were that the companies had to reduce their carbon emissions in both autos and aerospace, and Denmark, conditions attached to you can't use tax havens if you're going to be accessing public bailouts. So, all this is really about making sure that we restructure our systems that can be focused on big outcomes that we need as society. Again, I keep coming back to those SDGs, but the real question of what it means for the governance of the public sector to be explicitly about market shaping, not only market fixing, but also in the business sector to be more purpose-oriented, but bringing that purpose to the center of how public and private interact. I have a new book coming out. Sorry to be so self-promotional here, but it's coming out in January, which gets very detailed. It's almost a how-to manual around all these different issues, just because I'm getting very impatient with the pace of change. So I hope that when I do come to Budapest, I will be able to focus on the nitty-gritty, and hopefully we can invite some of your civil servants from the Hungarian government, but especially make sure that this is a disruptive agenda. This cannot be one that everyone cozily comes together thinking, oh yes, let's do the moonshots. This is really about rethinking what kind of society we want to live in and making sure that we transform the tools on the ground, the leverage points, in ways that allow us to really be as revolutionary in our walk as we are in our talk. And I do genuinely think that it has to be underpinned by hope and optimism. We're not going to get anywhere by fear. And that's why I finished the last chapter of the book on value with economics of hope. And just thank you again to Rajk College. Sorry, I know you've changed your name. It's no longer Rajk László, but Rajk College, you and your students, thank you so much for giving me this honor, and apologies for going 2 minutes over.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your lecture. I would now like to start the Q&A session of this event and ask the audience to put questions to Professor Mazzucato. The first question comes from Reinhard Weisinger. He asks, does your concept of the entrepreneurial state also apply to societies like China?
Very good question. So I would argue, and I wrote about this in I was interviewed from The Banker, the magazine for the Financial Times some time ago, and they asked me about that. And I argued that actually, interestingly, China, I feel, is learning the lessons of what actually got us to Silicon Valley more than the US has. The US is currently underinvesting in all those different types of institutions, the ARPA-E, DARPA, NIH kind, but especially questioning, and I'm thinking of, I don't want to get too political here, but it's not a moment of, dynamism and rethinking the public service right now in the US. Whereas in China, quite curious that a lot of the investments that were required even to get us companies like Huawei, and this is interesting again because Huawei, of course, is very much in the news, but both Huawei, so in telecoms, but also some of the most ambitious renewable energy companies in China would not have existed without that patient long-term finance, for example, from the Chinese Development Bank. There's a very good book on this written by two journalists from Bloomberg called Rethinking the Rules of Finance, I think. But more so, I think what's interesting is because of their massive pollution problem, which is extremely serious, they have been, for quite some time, for the last 10 years, talking about the need for long-term planning around greening their whole economy, and they're spending $1.7 trillion to do that. And what's interesting there is they're interacting, though, with countries like Denmark, which have, because of their own mission-oriented policies, developed a very dynamic service sector around green. So Denmark today is the #1 provider of high-tech digital services to Chinese investments in greening their economy. Having said that, I think the big challenge to China, besides the issues around democracy, which I'm not raising here because that's not my area, is this issue of needing a decentralized network of state institutions across the whole innovation chain, which was very important in the US. And the Chinese pots of investment right now are much bigger and risk having that kind of top-down, potentially rigid structure, which we know from the systems of innovation literature, people like Chris Freeman wrote about this, was a problem for the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union was spending a lot on R&D, but was not very dynamic in terms of how the science industry linkages were happening across different types of institutions.
Thank you, Professor. The next question is from Marcell Farkas. And he asks, as industrial policy in the EU is predominantly horizontal, can we say that the EU states will not become entrepreneurial in the near future?
So that's a really good question. The concept of missions is not trying to say that horizontal investments aren't important. By horizontal, for those viewing us not from the policy or economics community, horizontal investments are investments that are, again, kind of in the basic things we need: education, research, basic infrastructure. Vertical investments are the kinds of investments I mentioned before in old style industrial strategies, picking sectors or technologies. What the missions concept tried to do for Europe was to say we need to rethink the vertical away from a list of sectors or technologies, precisely because the technology historically has come about from problems. We should be focused on the problems. So what are the big problems that Europe needs to solve? And what are the redesign of our vertical strategies to be more problem focused and less just a list of sectors or technologies or types of firms requiring support. And, you know, it is a moment where Europe has chosen to go this way. So then the Horizon program, which is close to 100 billion euros, has a chunk of it for these mission-oriented policies. The problem is, if you look at how much the US has spent, right, and that is a fair comparison, you have Europe and the US, which are comparable in terms of net GDP, the US spends just 40 billion just on health innovation to the National Institutes of Health. So you could argue that the amount of money that we are putting, for example, in Europe towards some of these, you know, key areas is not close to enough. But that would also be unfair, because then we need to look at the member states, and they, of course, have their own funds. So how to design European policy to galvanize and catalyze and crowd in other forms of both public and private finance, that's going to be the real trick. And that's why we need to redesign our policies to be much more ambitious. Otherwise, there's no crowding in effect. Too many policies, when they're badly devised, just increase profits. And profits are at a record level right now. There's no profit problem. There's a labor share problem, not a profit problem. What we need is more ambitious policies that galvanize business investment. Investment is really should be the focus, and investment also towards meeting some of the goals that I was talking about throughout the talk.
Thank you,
So
Professor.
I think I have hope. But you're right, we need change.
Sorry about that, so thank you. Now the third question is from Balázs Pluhar. He asks, could COVID-19 affect the acceptance of government intervention in the same way as World War I and World War II did?
Great question. So that's really interesting because, you know, there's a lot of attention right now to the fact that there's a lot of money that's coming out of governments in order to help both businesses, but also citizens. In the UK, for example, we had a furlough scheme where the government was covering 80% of wages, and different countries have had similar schemes. And the amount of investment is huge. In Europe, the total amount of the recovery is just from the European Union is coming close to 2 trillion euros, with the EU next gen bit of it about 800 billion. So there's a lot of money being thrown, into the system, similar to, as the question inspires, in the wartime periods, but also you could argue similar to the financial crisis, when, again, lots of money went into the system to save basically the capitalist system from falling apart. But we need to learn two lessons, both from World War II, but also from the financial crisis. The financial crisis, the problem was that a lot of that money just ended up back in the financial system. It wasn't directed. It was, meant to mainly and not only bail out banks in different sectors, but it wasn't actually literally building back better to make sure we went to the source of what the problem was in the first place. One of the problems in the first place was very high levels of private debt. Even though many countries then went on to worry about public debt, it was private debt that actually got us into the crisis. And today we have, again, record levels of private debt to disposable income. So we obviously haven't cured that part of the problem. But also, again, the finance didn't really reach the real economy, building better structures and building more sustainable systems and production systems, So that's a big mistake, and we can't afford to do that again. We need, at this moment, with the money that's going in the very first instance, strengthen our global health systems. This global pandemic requires us to strengthen the health systems underlying it, which we've discovered in many countries just were not ready to cope. And the pandemic, because it's global, wakes us up to the fact that we're only as healthy as our neighbor is. Literally on our street, in our city, in our nation, and globally. Had this pandemic begun in a country that had weaker health systems than China, we would all globally be worse off. So that's just a stark, importance to remember. World War II is interesting because not only did government obviously finance the war, but it also helped to transform production in the private sector. There was, for example, the Defense Production Procurement Act in the US that actually came about, I think, later in the Korean War, but there was different, in wartime scenarios in general, what happens is that government needs to produce stuff, right? And will require, just like we did now with COVID, businesses to produce now PPE, and of course the vaccine and therapies, and will do all it can to help galvanize that production in the private sector, as well as do what it itself can do. The problem is, in many countries, there's been deindustrialization. So even if you, use your power as a government to tell business, like happened in World War II, where the automobile industry had to actually convert itself to produce what the government needed. If in the same time we've deindustrialized our manufacturing, there's not much to convert. It's hard to transform a hedge fund or a consulting company into a structure that produces PPE. Having said that, what's super interesting is if you look globally at countries, how they've interacted with COVID-19, those countries that have been able to really redesign and actively use their procurement to do so, to really then create that capacity in the business sector, but also to have trust with citizens. Trust is very important. But also, again, those countries that invested within the public service, as opposed to just outsourcing it to consulting companies, fared better. And in developing countries like Kerala and Vietnam, they are not rich like, say, the UK, but they actually did better than the UK did, which unfortunately, historically, in recent years, has not only been cutting its public health system, but also its capacity in some ways to govern with this over-reliance on the big four consulting companies, or even managing Brexit, not doing too well on that, but also companies like Serco and G4S, which, I have nothing against outsourcing some things, but the real issue that I think my presentation raises is when you're outsourcing your capacity, your capabilities, your knowledge creation processes, then it's going to be very hard to govern any sort of crisis. And I think that's really the big lesson. It's not just about World War II, throwing money into the system. It's, do we actually also at the same time have strong private and public institutions that together can solve the problems? And that hopefully will be a wake-up call in terms of the kinds of investments, but also partnerships that we need for the future.
Thank you, Professor. The fourth question comes from Anna Toth, who asks, would a shift to a more entrepreneurial state change the underlying logic of bureaucracy in a country? Can this result in the corporatization of the public sector?
That's interesting, because I would argue we have had corporatization in some ways of the public sector, because we haven't recognized its dynamic role, its potential dynamic role. I'm from Italy, so I know, we have lots of bureaucracy in the US, in Italy, like in many countries. There's also corruption, like in many countries. So it's not about glorifying the public sector, but its potential role to be a real value creator, market shaper, driven by the goals that matter to citizens, requires a level of flexibility, adaptability, and dynamism, which you wouldn't think is a corporatist structure. In fact, what it requires is a decentralized network of dynamic public organizations that also have internal debates of what they're doing. I'm working right now with the BBC, the public broadcaster in the UK, around its own organizational governance, or institutes doing that. And so thinking through, what does it mean to build public value for a public broadcaster? If you just took the market fixing lens, you'd think that a public broadcaster like the BBC or Rai in Italy and your own Hungarian national TV should at best do high quality news and say documentaries and leave the rest to the private sector. Whereas the BBC, because it's always been driven by this very interesting and internal debate, heated debate about public value, dared to delve into areas like soap operas and talk shows, but from a lens of public value, right? So creating EastEnders, basically a soap opera about the working class, not like Dallas and Dynasty, just about the 1%. And did it very well. And everyone, most British people have watched that. Also talk shows that would be focused around actually creating debate about important issues around race, gender, ethnicity, and equality. So by being entrepreneurial, the point was not big state, corporatist state. It was the state as a galvanizer, as a thought leader, which then crowds in, again, business investment. That's in fact what the BBC has done through historically many of its investments, including on the iPlayer, which is its own platform for all its public radio and public television, has benefited also other broadcasters also in the private sector in terms of the innovations that have come out of that, the lessons of how to do that with ITV, for example. But anyway, I don't want to go too much into the details there, but just to say that the ambition should be not to create a big block, bureaucratic, slow, entrepreneurial state. That wouldn't be entrepreneurial. That's just a big state. So the whole point of the entrepreneurial state is to build a smarter state, a more flexible state. It still needs proper funding. It's not going to be done on the back of an envelope, but it does focus more on the organizational competence in the decentralized network across the whole innovation chain versus just these blocks of public money thrown into the system and hoping for the best.
Thank you, Professor. The fifth question is from Pablo Sanabria, and it goes like this. How would you apply the entrepreneurial state in countries where private actors commonly capture the government and the state operates in the context of corruption and clientelism?
So unfortunately, that's many states. And it's not just in some developing world countries. Again, I think I already mentioned the challenges we have in Italy. So the irony is that sometimes people think, oh, the entrepreneurial state, you must be thinking, again, of a big state, and that means it's going to have a heavy hand and also be corrupted along the way by different interests, because there will just be, an objective of power, for example, that will be driving it. So this is the whole point, because those problems of corruption and of bureaucracy and slowness, exist. That's why we need to rethink the state. And a state that's more confident understands its role in co-creating value and is pressured to create value for a public purpose by the citizens, right? Will be a state that I believe will be better able to resist or to fight the challenges of both, corruption and incompetence. Why? Because first of all, by being ambitious, that your role is really to, create change and not just to facilitate, it also attracts interesting people into government. I often say that Obama would not have been able to hire Nobel Prize winning physicists to run the DOE, Department of Energy, Steve Chu, had he not also at the same time said he wanted to direct the fiscal stimulus package after the crisis towards a green direction. That's what Steve Chu was interested in. It wasn't to come in and create an R&D tax credit for Elon Musk. So one thing is, who even works in government, making it a place that is also attracting the best and brightest is part of that, problem. But also by having that internal discussion about what are you for, public purpose, co-shaping towards goals of inclusion and sustainability, if then it becomes serious, and this is what I meant by we need to get our hands dirty and create almost manuals of what does this mean for public-private partnerships, then that whole issue of conditionality, for example, rises up. If you think of your role just as facilitating, enabling, then of course you should just hand out money, subsidies and guarantees that might facilitate, make things easier. And of course you'll be captured along the way by those particular interests that need help, whether they're an ailing steel industry or a new startup that just because it's a startup requires a finance, or issues that are much more serious around nepotism and corruption. If instead the point is you are there to create fundamental change, like a green transition, the relationship between the public sector and the private sector will be around that change that needs to happen. So an example would be the KfW public bank in Germany. When the steel sector asked to get help in recent years from the German government because they had an Energiewende mission up top, and because the bank itself saw itself not as just handing out money, but helping to achieve a public goal, they created conditions that steel had to lower its material content in order to access that public fund. So a focus on transformation and additionality, which is core to the entrepreneurial state principle, is, I think, one of the ways not to kill off completely corruption, because that will require lots of different antennae to be up, but I think it actually helps to limit it, because the focus becomes transformation as opposed to just receiving. So any sort of handout to business can get much more easily corrupted than a pressure on business to transform, to be both more inclusive, paying workers better, having better working conditions, but also steering towards a green direction.
Thank you, Professor, for your answer. The next question is from Monica Williams, who asks, could you expand on how the state might work collaboratively with entrepreneurs and communities, and how design thinking plays a role?
Thank you for that question. In fact, my institute is in a design school at University College London, the Bartlett School for the Built Environment, which is increasingly interested in issues of sustainability, prosperity, purpose, and bringing a design thinking lens to it. So again, question is very welcome. I think there's several things one could say. One is the notion that markets are outcomes, as I began my lecture with. They're outcomes of how we govern organizations. That is a design challenge, right? That's how do we design a public organization? Instead of just saying we need public money, the question is, how do we actually design our instruments to actually achieve these public objectives? And that itself is a design issue, because unfortunately we have often very static, linear, top-down design structures, but also design structures that are not participatory. So I'm extremely happy that Hilary Cottam has joined our institute. She's been thinking about how do you redesign the welfare state with the citizen at the center, in terms of making it not only easy to access welfare services, but also enhancing of your experience. This is also why we brought Mike Bracken, who set up government digital services into the institute. Mike and his team, who set up government digital services to form what later became gov.uk, which won an international design award for a public web platform. Their team actually came from the BBC, coming back to my point before, how the BBC has really nurtured top talent because of this ambition it's had around public value. But the first thing they did when they entered the cabinet office was to rethink the citizen. What is the citizen? Is it a client, a customer, as that public choice theory and new public management stuff that I was talking about before? Or is the citizen, not only a user, is a user, not a client or customer, a user of all these different services, public services that government puts out? And how do we put the citizen at the core of how we design, right, something like a public website, gov.uk? And they talk a lot about how that citizen-centered design affected how they then created it. But lastly, I think we need to design participation into the way that we think about these problems that I say should be focusing our policy, right? If you don't want policy as a list of sectors, but on problems, who defines those problems? That itself is a design challenge, and probably the one that we're least equipped for. Many governments don't have much training in how do you listen. Academics don't either, as you can tell. I talk too much. But how do you really listen to the needs of different parts of your population and design a collaboration that is truly collaborative, listening, trialing out, experimentation. In the Institute, we call this also, we have policy labs, which are very participatory. But again, the first issue is how do you actually listen to what people are saying they need, which doesn't mean you end up producing everything people need, but you need to even think about, empathy 101, which is not on the curriculum, believe me, in most masters in public administration. But bringing, thinking through citizen assemblies and ways that even, the example would be trade unions, for example, which in some cases are worried about a green transition because of all the jobs that might go in the fossil fuel fueled sectors. They are not against the green transition, but they've been thinking of the just transition. How do you make sure that the transition is designed in such a way that people are invested in and they're retrained in order to be a productive part of this greener economy? But one could say that itself is a design challenge, because by thinking of a just transition, you're coming to the process after someone else has designed the transition itself, and you're just saying, make it just. Whereas the real challenge is how do you bring labor's voices, students' voices, the green movement's voices to the table ex ante, not just ex post. And that I really think is the biggest design challenge. I don't think our democracies currently are well structured to do that. And that's where we need new organizations, new ways of participating in that kind of way that I mentioned, Ada Colau did in Barcelona, where they had to redesign how hackers came into the city government to help the city create a more direct relationship with data as it's constantly created and the benefits that citizens get from public services like public transport, but they also brought citizens to the table to do that. That required new organizations and methods of interaction.
Thank you, Professor. The next question is from Tornike Sivada, who asks, how is it possible for developing countries to catch up if there is a monopoly, if there's a patent monopoly on frontier technologies?
Exactly. Good question. So we need to be fighting against these monopolistic rents, because temporary monopolies are fine, right? They are patents themselves. There's nothing wrong with the concept of a patent. A patent does fix one of the problems, which is if you really had free markets as the benchmark notion of perfect competition assumes, one of the properties is free flow of information, right? So why would you innovate if as soon as you innovate, someone else can copy you? So that's what the patent is meant to do. It gives you that kind of temporary monopoly period. It's not even that temporary, 20 years, where you actually can protect this new knowledge that you've created. The problem is that if it's that what the state gets in exchange for that, because it's a contract, right? It's not from God, it's from the state. What the state gets is that that knowledge is then codified, as opposed to being tacit, as it used to be in the Middle Ages. It's codified so that once the patent is up, it's easier for that knowledge to be fully diffused and deployed by all sorts of other actors. But if in the meantime, you're not governing the patent system to make sure that knowledge is actually eventually going to be diffused, and you are allowing, for example, the research tools themselves to be patented, which they shouldn't, right? That's very new, actually, in the history of innovation. It used to be more the downstream elements of the innovation chain that were patented, not the tools. And if patents are allowed to be abused by being too wide, used for strategic reasons, and too strong, hard to license, that stifles innovation. It's what William Baumol called unproductive entrepreneurship, as opposed to productive entrepreneurship. It's what Adam Smith was worried about when he talked about the free market, free from rent seeking. So this rent seeking and extractive model of the patent system especially disadvantages developing countries, but not only, it also hurts all sorts of people in developed countries. But it's especially problematic in developing countries because a lot of innovation in developing countries at least first begins with imitation. And if you're not able to imitate because the patent system has been badly structured and abused, you will not be growing through innovation.
I'm afraid we don't have any more time for more questions, but I would like to thank you, Professor, for being here tonight.
Thank you. It's been a real honor, and I must say, when I come to Budapest, I'll give you all a, hopefully not a socially distanced hug. Hopefully by then we'll all be able to to sit in a bar and have a drink, but I'm looking forward to it also because I understand that I'll be giving some lectures on more deep dives around some of these issues. But thank you so much for the opportunity and the honor.
Now that our evening is coming to its end, I would like to remind everyone that video recordings have been made of this lecture, so be sure to follow the John von Neumann Award Facebook page if you would like to stay updated. Thank you all for attending the 2020 John von Neumann Award ceremony and lecture. Have a nice evening.